everyone, and a Happy New Year, and a very warm welcome to the ORFC session, The New Business of Carbon Farming and Other Nature-Based Solutions, Panacea or Disaster. I hope you've all had a restful break, something that we all, I'm sure, desperately need, as I have, to take a kind of step back from the crisis that we were surrounded by last year, this kind of pervasive, constant crisis. And I was thinking, as I was thinking about this session this morning, I was listening to the news and kind of got immediately jolted out of any sense of rest or a break by the news of the heat wave across Europe, 19-degree temperatures in Belarus. And this is hot on the heels of the Arctic bomb, storm in the US, the cyclone Sitarang in India and Bangladesh. And we're, of course, still reeling from the food price crisis, where many of us are still fighting for the structural solutions that we need. And for some of us, the year also ended with the two big global conference of the parties, as it's called, of two of the three Rio conventions, the Climate Conference of Parties that was in Egypt and the Convention on Biological Diversities Conference of Parties, both of which largely, I would say, failed to really embed justice or historical responsibility or stop corporate power, but both of which rather promoted different versions of what we're discussing here today, the so-called nature-based solutions as carbon and nature offsets. So some of you may have heard the term nature-based solutions, or maybe some of its linked concepts, nature positive, which was pushed a lot during the Convention on Biological Diversity, natural carbon removals, natural climate solutions, and of course, net zero, which is pervasive throughout all of our government and corporate climate language. But together, all these concepts actually form a very well thought out strategy of capital and corporations to use the crises we are facing for more accumulation, what some of us call the commodification of everything, of things that have so far escaped global commodification, oceans, mangroves, carbon, nature, seeds, soils, our labor, the work of peasants and all our local communities. And it is certainly my assessment, and I think probably shared by many of our speakers here, that what we're discussing here today, these concepts are set to become one of the biggest threats to our achievement of agroecology and food sovereignty in the future. So I'm really glad that we're having this session here. It is the beginning of a discussion, I think, of something that is developing and growing, that many of us are keeping a close eye on and trying to raise awareness of as much as possible and discuss with other people in the movement. So we have an hour and a half and 5 fantastic speakers who are all comrades of organizations I deeply admire and work very closely with in the struggle for food sovereignty and environmental justice, and have especially worked with recently on the rise of nature-based solutions. They will all provide perspectives from 4 different continents and also different ways of assessing this new threat to agroecology, justice, and small-scale food producers. I think it's quite telling for me that all the people here in the panel and several others, all of us have worked closely for many years, but in parallel, almost 3 or 4 years ago, started tracking and getting very worried about the rise of these concepts about 3 or 4 years ago. And many of the things that all of us have expected and discussed are now happening concretely in both policies, government policy, global policy, but also corporate projects across the globe. So we are really glad to be discussing this more and more with everybody else who is also concerned. Just to say, we have the speakers, but we also have a time for Q&A, hopefully a good amount of time, at least half an hour, if not more. But if you keep posting questions in the chat, we will take them in the question and answer session later. So don't worry if they are not being picked up immediately. We will definitely have a look at them later. So yeah, without any more introduction, I think to start us off, I would like to first invite Jutta, who's a researcher and writer who applies her work to support social movements and environmental networks, particularly in the global south. Jutta has published extensively on carbon markets and the new economy of nature in maintaining ecologically unequal trade and the associated violation of human rights and rights to land and the use of people's traditional territories. She also works with the World Rainforest Movement. And last year, Jutta and I worked very closely on a report exposing the threats of NBS to food sovereignty and agroecology. And I'll post links to this and all the other materials mentioned by the speakers as well in the chat, and we can share it with you all later if you need. So Jutta, please do take the phone.
Thank you, Kirtana, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you all and in a discussion with you all. Without losing much time, because the time is very short that we have for a topic that could cover days, let me start with saying that many people think that carbon farming and other nature-based solutions are a way to provide additional income for farmers, and that they are a sign of the long-denied recognition of the value of agroecology and family farming practices. And I hope that with the conversations today, we can show that in reality, these ideas are really deceptive and deceitful ways of increasing corporate control over land, and they will result, and actually are already resulting, as we will hear from some of our colleagues, in yet more corporate land grabbing, particularly, but not exclusively, in the global south. And digital means of controlling are really part and parcel of carbon farming and other nature-based solutions. There is no carbon farming without a carbon farming app. And those apps are usually provided, if you apply them and are following the instructions given by the carbon farming program, they provide an phenomenal amount of information about the makeup of soils on the farm to the providers of the apps, which include some of the largest IT companies such as Microsoft. And this, the passing on of information, I should add, often happens without the farmers being fully aware of how and what information is being transferred. So let's look at some of the terminology in this first session that really underpins the idea of carbon farming and other so-called nature-based solutions rhetoric, and ask ourselves a little bit what, but also who is behind those beautiful words, particularly like nature-based solutions that, like Kirtana said at the beginning, is one that's like the umbrella term, and a particularly dangerous one, because it rolls off the tongue. And it triggers one set of ideas and imaginations in our brains about the world we want, about a world where agroecology plays a big role and where justice it has advanced a lot more. But it triggers a very different set of imagery in, let's say, the corporate brains. And as we'll hear from others on the panel, maybe or despite or maybe because of the nice sound of that terminology, nature-based solutions are really everything but a solution for those who seek to contribute to thriving family and peasant farming community. And they certainly will not help avert climate chaos or reduce deforestation or soil erosion, because nature-based solutions have been designed as a way to compensate for continued destruction and pollution elsewhere. They're designed as offsetting instruments, and that means pollution can continue and destruction can continue in one place as long as the polluter or those who destroy can show on paper that destruction or pollution has been compensated by someone elsewhere. So inevitably, because of the design, nature-based solutions will lead to massive corporate land grabs, and they already are. And they will also increase corporate control over land, again, particularly, but not only in the global south. And how exactly that works and how nature-based solutions are increasing corporate control over land is something we can dive into in the Q&A sessions, if you like. So let's take a look at what and who is hiding behind some of the most frequently used terms in this discussion. The who is more straightforward, so let's start with that. First slide, the biggest proponents and the creators of the concept of nature-based solutions, they include the corporate oil, gas, and mining industry, the agribusiness, and the fertilizer industry with Yara, Bayer, and others. They are very active proponents of nature-based solutions and carbon farming. And of course, the IT companies like Microsoft and Amazon. They are aided by the conservation industry, including some of the world's largest conservation NGOs, and to name a few, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, WWF, and Environmental Defense have all been very strong proponents and creators of the idea of nature-based solutions. And I think it's those are all entities that really in the past haven't shown themselves to be allies to the agroecology and justice movements. On the contrary, for the corporate sector, their business model really involves massive land grabs, control over peasant farming land and indigenous peoples' territories, and the business model is built on destruction of nature. So why is it that those very companies that continue to destroy nature as part of their business model all of a sudden show interest in saving nature? You see an image of the webpage from the Italian oil company. On its website, an oil company having a picture and message like this on its webpage, saying it is a company committed to protecting and conserving forests. One question to ask is, why hasn't any other oil company put a similar commitment on their website to protecting and conserving the underground carbon stores, i.e. the oil, gas, and coal reserves that they continue to destroy? So there are, I believe, a lot of questions to ask on why those companies that continue to destroy nature are such big proponents of the so-called nature-based solutions. Well, they're not really interested in saving nature. What they are interested in, and what imaginations the term nature-based solutions triggers in their brains, is very different, and I would say incompatible with the image that the term triggers in the brains of the broader public. They see nature-based solutions as a provider of carbon credits, in the future increasingly of biodiversity credits. They also see it as a new way of making money from speculation on price movements with the trade in these credits. And of course, this idea of carbon credits, carbon offsets, means that they can continue to profit as well from the destruction that is at the heart of their business model. Maybe one point on the side, by definition, generating and trading these offset credits, it always requires denying the uniqueness of a place. And it reduces that uniqueness of the place with its stories, with its histories, and with its interrelations that are different from any other place, into a subset of measurable units that can be swapped for units of the same kind from another place. So these carbon and biodiversity offsets, or indulgences, if you wish, they justify more destruction and pollution on that empty promise that elsewhere a comparable amount of the same kind of pollution or destruction has been prevented, or that extra carbon is somehow parked in trees, in peat lands, or in soils, and therefore there's more space all of a sudden for more fossil carbon in the atmosphere. As I just mentioned from the beginning, we can take the slides off until the end. for the third one. And as I mentioned, from the beginning, companies and industrialized country governments also, they have been interested in nature-based solutions, primarily as a provider of carbon credits or carbon offsets, as they're also called. The concept of nature-based solutions is a reinvention and an extension of an earlier idea, the idea of REDD, which is the abbreviation in English for reducing emissions from deforestation and from forest degradation. The concept of REDD was introduced in 2005, kind of as a complement to the first international carbon trading instrument, the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism, the Kyoto Protocol being the first international climate treaty. There's no time to go into the detail of that history, but the starting point for REDD was always the assumption that offering a little financial reward to those wanting to destroy forests would convince them to drop their plans, and in exchange for a REDD payment, start to protect the forest instead. That didn't happen. That assumption never materialized. And 15 years on, the concept introduced into the UN negotiations as REDD, with the promise that it would lead very quickly and very cheaply to reductions of emissions from tropical forest destruction. It has failed on many grounds. And in the chat, I think Kirtana is posting the link to a short article that alerts us to, yes, there is failure because deforestation is still massively high, but REDD has not failed everybody. I won't go into that, but it has definitely also brought its benefits, particularly for the polluting industries. And it's still presented as a success by many who have a vested interest in the idea of REDD as a provider of carbon credits. And by shifting the goalposts of what was supposed to be achieved, the failure in reducing deforestation has been turned into success. One reason why deforestation rates haven't really come down as was promised under REDD is that most of the REDD activities, they are focused on peasant and forest people's farming and use of the land, and not on those responsible for the really large-scale deforestation. In fact, you could argue that REDD has made corporate destruction of forests less visible, because all the focus in the last 15 years has increasingly shifted and been put by REDD on peasant farming and shifting cultivation. Many REDD projects, also coming back to the point I made, or the alert I raised at the beginning, many REDD projects about digital control, many REDD projects, they use drones and cameras to monitor who is using the land and how areas within the REDD project are being used. And there are penalties for those who use the land in a way that the REDD project owners don't approve of. And you can imagine many conflicts, because in general, the project owner comes from outside the area with very dodgy land claims. So in light of the resounding failure that was increasingly difficult to hide, and also growing bad press about the conflicts that REDD projects were causing on the ground, the conservation industry and the corporate proponents of the idea, they really needed a new term, and REDD never served them very well, because it was not a term that easily triggered images in our minds. So a new term was needed to continue both the funding for this idea of conservation as a way of compensating increased destruction or burning of fossil fuels. And that new term is nature-based solutions. It had a lot of advantages over REDD because nature-based solutions, we all have an idea of what that could be. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, different interests have very different ideas of what that is, and that plays into the hands of those who want to use nature-based solutions to as a way to create carbon credits, but need others with different ideas than that to go along and present the impression that nature-based solution has a strong and big following. Nature-based solutions also goes beyond REDD. REDD was an instrument that was focused very much on forests, like the name already says, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Nature-based solutions expands the range of land use that can be included in the term. Yes, and I will wrap up in a second. And one reason for that expanded coverage isn't that the need to or the interest to provide more recognition and funding for family farmers, but the scale of land demanded by corporate interests for carbon offsets. Over the past few years, many companies, you name them, Shell, Total, Nestle, Danone, Cargill, they have all made pledges to run what they call net zero emissions operations. But net zero isn't real zero, and all the companies are planning to continue to burn fossil fuels on quite a massive scale and over quite some decades into the future. So net zero allows the pollution to continue as long as an equal number of carbon credits is added to the balance sheet to balance out the emissions. So net zero emissions always means offsetting. And the same goes for net positive, the term that Kirtana just mentioned. And to finish off, so all the net zero pledges and carbon positive or net positive pledges, they all mean a perpetuation of fossil fuel extraction, of agribusiness, and of the damage that comes with that. And to finish off with the last slide, let's have a quick look to refresh our mind on the bewildering and confusing terminology that comes with nature-based solutions. Kirtana, the last slide. Yeah. Maybe we keep that for the question. There it is. The slide really to remind ourselves where of how those different terms also fit together. So starting from REDD on the left, REDD was about avoiding emissions from deforestation and was expanded as one of the so-called nature-based solutions, which is a much broader concept that also, and this is where carbon farming and tree planting and soil programs, soil carbon programs come in, as well as the restoration of forests and mangroves. All of those initiatives, REDD, as well as what carbon farming and so on, falls under the umbrella of so-called nature-based solutions. They go hand in hand with the net zero pledges that many companies have made, or the net positive pledges, and they inevitably mean carbon offsetting of the continued pollution to arrive at a net zero. Carbon removals, a term I didn't mention much, but you can see in the diagram, it's another term also used for a particular kind of nature-based solutions, and that's the kind of activities that draw carbon out of the atmosphere, that remove carbon from the atmosphere. So storing it in the soils, using soils differently so they can store more carbon. Or planting trees or restoring mangroves. So carbon that was in the atmosphere can be parked in those places. And yeah, I leave it there, and we'll skip the technological carbon removal ideas. They are things like burning biomass and capturing it, and other technological means of very speculative and not really functioning yet. That's where I will leave it, and we can come back in the discussion on to some of those points. Back to Kirtana.
Okay, thank you very much, Jutta. Yeah, there was a huge sweep through a lot of the interconnected and fairly complex, I think, terminology that's being used. And I think it shows that there is a kind of joined up agenda, although they're being promoted in different ways in different places. Actually, a lot of what links all the different concepts is the kind of agenda of greenwashing, but also deepened and extended control over resources and territories of people. Uh, the next up, we have Vitor Rodrigues, who is a member of the coordination committee of the European coordination of Via Campesina, where he deals mostly with the agricultural public policies. But he's also a member of the directive board of CNA, the National Confederation of Agriculture, the small scale and family farming representatives in Portugal. And Victor is going to talk to us about how some of this is unfolding in a very concrete way at the European level, where at the moment we have last year, the European Commission unveiled a package, their climate package, Fit for 55 climate package, which brings all of these, which is basically enabling regulation, policy, and developing a market to create a market for soil carbon, but also a market to allow net zero to flourish, meaning to actually allow offset mechanisms from forests, but also from soil carbon in Europe to offset fossil fuel emissions, but also emissions from agribusinesses in across Europe. So it's a very dangerous piece of legislation, which some of us have been tracking, and it's a very we think it will be a kind of world leading, as the European emissions trading scheme kind of embedded the idea of carbon markets as a possible way to address climate change. This is also something that we should all be keeping a close eye on how it's happening. So without any further explanation, Vitor, please, can you go ahead?
Thank you, Kirtana. That was, in fact, an excellent introduction for my communication. I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for having invited the ECVC, the European Coordination of Via Campesina, to be here in this very important conference. It is
Vitor, sorry,
yeah.
we can't see you. So I don't know if you're able to turn off your camera, but
okay,
otherwise
now I am.
Okay.
I was trying to,
perfect.
but Zoom didn't let me. But here I am. So as I was saying, we are very happy to be part of this conference. Thankful to all the organizers for having invited us. Thanks to Kirtana for the support, logistical support during this communication. It's a pleasure to share this panel with all the other speakers that are doing their presentations about this theme. Can we go for the first slide, please? This presentation, like as Kirtana have said, is about the proposal of the European Commission about carbon farming, but is also about the alternative, the systemic approach that ECVC stands for as an alternative to this deceptive mechanism of tackling climate change. Next slide, please. The initial problem is that carbon farming is based on a trending approach worldwide, but in the EU in particular, that reduces environmental problems only to climate change, and climate change only to carbon emissions. And it relies on the misconception that it's possible to maintain carbon emissions provided they are offset elsewhere, as has been said earlier. However, both climate change and the environment in general rely directly on or indirectly on more variables, which in turn are also affected by agriculture. It's not only the farming techniques or the use of industrial inputs and technologies that matter, but also, for example, things like the spatial configuration of the territories in terms of field sizes, cultivated diversity, the presence of natural or semi-natural elements in the landscape, and the presence of people in the territories. That is for us a very big question, this of the presence of people in the territories. Next slide, please. European agriculture is still under a trajectory where there is a negative evolution in most of these socio-environmental aspects. The industrialization of the European Union agriculture, particularly in the context of global trade, has promoted land concentration, intensive cultivation in extensive monocultures, whether agricultural or forestry plantations, agricultural land abandonment, as well as the abandonment of rural territories. Next slide, please. Negative pressures have been increasing with the disruption of habitats and trophic relations, the increases in the use of industrial agrochemicals, water and energy, and augmented risks of pests, diseases, and pollution. The severe damages associated to extreme events are becoming more likely, not only because of climate change, but also due to a greatly reduced resistance capacity of agroecosystems and territories. Furthermore, agricultural land is under growing pressure to land use change for non-agricultural purposes, such as the production of renewable energies. This is a very huge problem in certain areas, like in Galicia, in the north of Spain, but also in Portugal, with the proliferation of the solar panels parks that we consider like the new cultivation in our territories. Likewise, food production faces additional pressures from increasing demands like biofuels or fibers. Next slide, please. In all of these processes, small and medium-scale farmers have been the most affected, although they are still able to provide a significant share of food with only 25% of utilized agricultural area. Small-scale farmers tend to use more labor instead of capital, more on-farm generated inputs instead of external inputs, and also tend to promote more diverse crops, preserve local biodiversity and knowledge, and consequently better farming practices. They also tend to feed local market dynamics, usually associated to better and more sustainable food products. Therefore, small-scale farmers have a necessary and indispensable role to play in promoting agricultural sustainability, not only by reducing emissions, but also by promoting agroecological practices better suited to the characteristics and possibilities of territories. Next slide. The approach of carbon farming does not take into account all these systemic links. It also does not offer any good prospects for small-scale farmers. Carbon farming relies on the principle of offsetting, which implies the substitution of emissions instead of reducing them. It also relies on the financialization of nature, or the commoditization, as have been said earlier. It implies distancing farming even more from its core object, that is, producing sustainable and healthy food. It comes with the prospect of substituting public support directed to farm income and the provision of externalities for private payments directed to eventual additional carbon sequestration, transferring risks to farmers in a time where farmers' incomes are being compressed by the sharp increases of the production costs. Thus, this approach casts more doubts than real good prospects, whether in terms of environmental performance, even if only the balance of carbon emissions is considered, or in terms of farmers' convenience. Firstly, as has already been pointed out, it entails a net zero philosophy, thereby not addressing properly the real need to decrease emissions. Another question that comes attached is the additionality that carbon farming solutions really bring. Can we talk about emissions balance improvement if the base scenarios for assessing additionality are already degraded scenarios, that is, scenarios with much more emissions and much less sequestration than they were some decades ago? And are carbon markets effective and reliable when it comes to ensuring stable and viable revenues to farmers, particularly to small-scale ones? Experience tells us that carbon markets are very volatile through time and geography. Next slide, please. Even in strict technical and governance terms, many questions remain unclear. If the purpose of offsetting is to be taken seriously, then a great deal of effort has to be made to standardize the items created by carbon farming and put into markets, as well as to settle and control farmers' performance. Carbon farming can also be another factor of inequality, since its technical and administrative demands will surely be more difficult to be met by small-scale farmers. Even its contribution to carbon removal will remain at stake, since it is not permanent and is instead reversible, because it is based on natural sinks and it will support only short-term projects. Moreover, small or even medium-scale farmers have reasons to fear that carbon farming will be an additional factor of pressure on land speculation, making land even more inaccessible to possible new farmers and contributing to land grabbing. All in all, if it is true that current public policies, such as the Common Agricultural Policy, are built on unjust criteria, clearly favoring large landowners, not properly acknowledging the systemic socioeconomic and environmental contribution of small-scale farming, and leaving the agricultural sustainability in the hands of underfunded agro-environmental measures and eco-schemes, it is also true that phasing out such support schemes, leaving environmental performance under strict market rules, it's likely to be an even worse solution. As it is said in the Real Zero Europe document, which ECVC subscribes, instead of dramatically reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the European Union opted to allow the continuation of industrial farming expansion, masking its damages with the delay of carbon removals to somewhere in the future and incentivizing technologies of removal that are yet very far away of being effective. Carbon farming is no real solution for climate change and for climate neutrality, and even less a solution for sustainable food systems. Although it relies on natural resources and on supposedly enhanced practices, it fails to provide a systemic acknowledgement of the relations between farming, climate, environment, and socioeconomic sustainability. It is a limited approach with which possible positive consequences are very likely to be offset by their negative implications. And it has nothing to do with the very much needed transition for agroecology and food sovereignty. Next slide, please. That's why ECVC has launched a manifesto for agricultural transition to address systemic climate crisis with 13 urgent actions aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the United Nations declarations on the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas. These actions constitute a systemic approach that is centered in the role of small-scale farming and on food sovereignty. In those measures, ECVC claims the implementation of the Green Deal, but not leaving anyone behind. Next slide, please. We call for doubling the number of farmers in Europe, ensuring access to land and generational renewal, with proper support and technical assistance, paving the way to agroecology. We claim the end of factory farms, a reduction in the use of synthetic fertilizers, and the ban of unproven and dangerous technologies. We call for the protection of seeds and biodiversity, for water efficiency and access to water. We also advocate territorialized food systems, including livestock farming, according to land capacity to provide fodder. Next slide, please. With the implementation of these actions, we will be able not only to reduce emissions, but also to capture and store more carbon and other greenhouse gases, and overall ensuring the sustainability and healthiness of food production, biodiversity, farmers' livelihoods, and the social and economic conditions of rural territories. That is our final message in the last slide, please. With all these 13 actions, we will be paving the way towards a more sustainable and sovereign future. Thank you very much once again for having us at this conference. This communication was based fundamentally in 3 documents that are listed in the last slides. Thank you, Kirtana, for all the support.
Thank you, Vitor. That was a fantastic, thanks so much. Yeah, it was really a fantastic, I think, very short view of both what we don't want to see, what's dangerous, but also what is the alternatives that we have all been, not just us in this session, but I think the whole of the ORFC and all the people who have been working within the food sovereignty movement have been proposing the answers for many decades now. And we have the answers do exist, and they look like some of the things that Vitor has been outlining. But these are not the same as, although they are twisted to use the same terminology, it's not the same as what is being proposed. So thank you very much for that. I think just one thing that really struck me during your presentation was that all the things that you were mentioning are actually already happening, right? Like we can see, for example, here in Scotland, where I am, we have more than, I think, over 250 carbon offset projects across Scotland, mainly in the Highlands, but in other places. And it's leading to massively inflated land prices. But also you see the same actors, the aristocracy, people who have owned, Scotland has very high level of land concentration, as I'm sure most of you know. And the same people who own the land are now benefiting from these carbon credit payments. So it's kind of also another way of increasing land concentration. So we can see that happening. We can also see that although many of the European Commission, for example, when they launched this package, said that farmers can be carbon farmers now. They don't have to be farmers that produce food. And you can see that they have this vision of actually getting rid of everybody from the countryside, that food provision can be done by agribusiness, and then maybe, people on the land, if they want, or, big farmers can make money from carbon farming. So it's a kind of quite a dystopian vision, but you can see where they're going with that. And even, I think it's very right that although sometimes the setup is not necessarily for a market mechanism immediately from soil carbon, they are creating the market to then be able to link it to private finance in the future. So I think it's all, very, very important things to be brought into the discussion. Thank you very much, Vitor. So I will move on next, if I can, to Shalmali. I hope that's okay, because we were going to have Ruth Nyambura, but she's having a bit of problem with her internet connection. So Shalmali, I hope it's okay if I move on to you now. Shalmali Guttal is the Executive Director of Focus on the Global South. She has been working on trade, investment, debt, the commons, land, resource, and food rights for over 30 years, with an emphasis on community and women's rights and democratization of governance. She works with several grassroots movements on the creation and governance of natural, social, and knowledge commons, strengthening food sovereignty and public goods and services. And certainly, I'm sure all of us who have been working on food sovereignty actually don't need an introduction. We all know Shalmali's work very well across all the different areas that she works on. And she's going to talk a little bit about the Asian situation, but also how some of the discourse on NBS and the concepts are impacting on agrarian justice, which is an important aspect of food sovereignty. Shalmali, please.
Thank you, Kirtana. Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good. So good evening, everyone. It's evening here in India, where I'm joining you from. I don't have any PowerPoint. I have a lot of written notes that I'll try and go through as quickly as I can, because our time is short. And what I'd like to do, as Kirtana said, is to table some issues regarding agrarian justice in the context of climate justice that are arising from carbon farming and these so-called nature-based solutions. Now, of course, as we all know, global warming and climate change are systemic issues. So strategies and actions to address them effectively also need to be system-wide and at multiple levels. And certainly, of course, actions are urgently needed to protect nature, nature's attributes, nature cycles, because we all live in nature. We cannot separate ourselves from nature. It is one of the biggest markers of human arrogance to think that we can somehow control nature. But without radical transformation of the superstructures that have brought us to these crisis situations, we will only deepen the sort of chasm between those who play with nature and those whose lives are embedded in nature. And then again, from a systemic perspective, climate justice cannot be separated from social, economic, political, and gender justice. The injustices and inequalities that characterize our societies, our economies, and politics also determine the kind and also the extent of impacts of climate change that are faced by different communities and people across the world. Now, coming to the food and agriculture area, let me just go into that a bit. Now, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, the world's smallholder farmers produce about a third of the world's food. Now, this is some new research and the new data they've started to gather, where they say 5 out of every 6 farms in the world consist of less than 2 hectares, and they operate only on 12% of all agricultural land in the world, but they produce roughly 35% of the world's food. And if you go into greater detail, I mean, I won't go into the whole thing about the study, I mean, the details of the study, but what's interesting that around 70% of all farms are operating on just 7% of agricultural land, but are less than 1 hectare. Another 14% of these farms, which control 4%, are between 1 and 2 hectares, and so on. So basically, we're saying that 5 out of 6 farms, are operating on consist of less than 2 hectares. In the meantime, the largest 1% of farms in the world, greater than 50 hectares, they operate more than 70% of the world's farmland. And nearly 40% of agricultural land found on farms is larger than 1,000 hectares. And these are some of the farms which are concentrated and where land is being concentrated, as Kirtana pointed out, as Vitor pointed out, and Jutta and others have pointed out. And I'm sure my colleague Devlin will talk about them as well. Now, even here, even in this new study where FAO is, I think, trying to grapple and sort out data, trying to get more detailed data on farm holdings, there are huge data gaps. Because if we actually look at measurements of land holdings, they're not necessarily accurate, because in many places there are absence of legal titles, location of farms, and what is really a farm, what is a small farm, what is a large, the categorization in different countries differs. But what we can say here is that with a certainty that smallholding food producers are responsible for feeding a significant proportion of the world's population. And they do so without, quote unquote, owning large farms or large parts of the land. Their ecological footprint is far lesser than the big farms and the big food production sort of entities, which have their own problems in terms of carbon footprints, as we've already talked about. But I won't go into the details here. Now, across much of Asia, smallholders struggle to survive on small land holdings of just 1 to 2 hectares, and often even less than a hectare. And their situations are increasingly precarious, with the impacts of climate change, high levels of indebtedness, and the near absence of publicly provided supports. Now, many are indigenous peoples, forest peoples, they're marine riverine communities who meet their food and livelihood needs through a combination of farming, foraging, gathering, fishing, and trapping, trapping small animals. And of course, also many of them have to do seasonal migration because they're not able to completely live off the land. Now, for these populations, their environments, their ecosystems, and biodiversity are central to their social cultural identities, to their knowledge systems, and their abilities to sustain themselves and their future generations. But at the same time, it's also widely accepted in the sort of global policy world that preserving, revitalizing, regenerating diverse natural environments and ecosystems and biodiversity and species are crucial for the future well-being of all human beings. So here is where we see now the clash, not the contradiction, but an assault on those who will play with nature, on those whose lives are embedded in nature. Because the revitalization and regeneration of diverse and natural environments and ecosystems that we're talking about are being promoted through carbon markets, carbon farming, and so-called green financing, which allow those who are already wealthy and have more than enough, to keep extracting, consuming, and polluting. And, Jutta already talked about it, so I won't go into those details. But from a justice point of view, an agrarian justice, but non-agrarian justice as well, we see that the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, the CBDR principle, is completely subverted. Now, those who continue to be least responsible for causing climate change, they're not only bearing the brunt of and are most exposed to the ravages of climate change events, but through offsets such as nature-based solutions, they're also at the greatest risk of insecurity, regarding losing land tenure and access to their territories through evictions and relocation. And there is a very real danger, which is already happening, of nature-based solutions resulting in nature-based dispossessions. Because inhabitants of territories that are most coveted for these nature-based solutions have already been facing severe persecution for a long time. Many of you may know the history of conservation projects and protected areas, which are built on the evictions and dispossession of local peoples, and then the exclusions of particular peoples. But those who don't inhabit these spaces have no symbiotic relationships with them. They consume the wealth extracted from them, and they are the ones who benefit from these conservation areas. Now, with carbon farming and the carbon markets, a whole new array of entry points are being opened up for alienating local people from their lands and territories. Because a carbon right is a new and it's sort of a unique form of land interest, that confers upon the holder some kind of a right to a non-material benefit of carbon sequestration on a piece of farm or a piece of forest land. But then who owns carbon rights in soil and nature? Now, if the tenurial user and stewardship rights of those who are farming those lands, who are living in those forests, who have been nurturing the biodiversity for generations, if their rights, if their claims are not recognized, then what benefits would they receive? And who will receive these benefits from them? We're seeing now, if you go to different corporate websites, the technical and digital corporations are already partnering with carbon credit firms and marketplaces for carbon verification, validation, and so on. So basically, an entire new array of opportunity making, an entire new array of opportunities for profit making are being opened up with carbon farming and these so-called nature-based solutions, where the targets are smallholders, our small-scale producers, our fishers, and our forest communities. But those who have no security of tenure or security of their legitimate claims to their ecosystems and environments. Now, if we look at India, for example, many market actors financing carbon farming are tied up with agribusiness corporations that already have business segments in biotechnology, seeds, and agrochemicals. So, for example, in India, one of the rapidly growing carbon credit programs is by Grow Indigo, which is a joint venture of Mexico Grow and Indigo Agriculture. Mexico Grow is an Indian corporation that formed a joint venture with Monsanto Investments in India called Mexico Monsanto Biotech India. And now this joint venture is part of the Bayer group of companies. And this is just one example. There are others like this, not just in India, but in other parts of Asia, where basically what's happening is that by partnering with digital agribusiness marketplaces for carbon credits, agribusiness corporations are able to enlarge their financial presence in the food and agriculture sectors, which in turn then enables increased corporate concentration. So this sort of carbon farming and these nature-based solutions will enable these agribusiness corporations to actually concentrate the markets even more at the cost of small-scale food producers, smallholders, indigenous people, and fishers. Now, Kirtana, how much more time do I have? Do I need to cover? Shall I wrap up now, or may I?
Yeah, another couple of minutes is okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And again, just looking at India's the example of India, for example, the government's official stance in India has been that forests, of course, are a net sink of carbon dioxide and so on. Now, in India, there are more than 300 or 400 million people who depend on forests for their livelihoods. And the Indian government says that their, the forest cover they've been increasing forest cover, and they're preparing themselves for this for carbon markets and new carbon sinks and carbon farming and so on. And they've just passed a new law in 2022 on energy conservation and so on, but which will enable carbon markets. But but the methodology for calculating forest cover is questionable, because some of the increased in forest cover has happened outside the area that's classified in land records as forests. So the increase in forest cover is happening in areas that's defined as open with canopy that's covering between 10 to 40%, which means that, or implies that forest cover is also supposedly increasing because of plantations, and which are, rubber, coconut, are non-forest species. And India has a compensatory afforestation fund management and planning authority, CAMPA. It's a big name, but basically what it is basically it's a fund that gets money for compensatory afforestation. So a big corporation can, acquire a large piece of land, and then whatever that land is, whether that's a forest land or that's an agricultural land or a grassland, and then they put a fund into this CAMPA fund, which is then used for afforestation elsewhere. And these kinds of schemes are there in India, but they're across Asia, and they're extremely problematic because they are undermining existing laws that have been enacted through people's struggles to secure the rights of forest communities and local producers and local fishers. So, for example, in India, we have the Forest Rights Act, which is being undermined by this, by this new push towards earning incomes through nature-based solutions and carbon farming. And the Forest Rights Act is being undermined to allow the eviction of people living in forest areas that are of economic significance to the government, whether it's for afforestation or reforestation. And one kind of a terminology that's often used is degraded forest and degraded land. And this is used not only in India, but it's also used in Thailand, it's used in Cambodia, it's used in the Philippines, it's used in Laos. The argument being that if it's a degraded land or a degraded forest, it's of no use to anybody, and therefore it's not pristine, and it can be then taken for these carbon schemes and reforestation schemes, which are then put into carbon markets. But the truth is that there is, these degraded, so-called degraded lands and degraded forests are actually of tremendous use to local communities for fodder, for firewood, for medicinal plants, for grazing, and so on. And so we're seeing entire livelihoods that are being destroyed because of these, because of this expansion of these types of carbon farming and nature-based solution schemes. The last point I just want to make here is that while the institutional infrastructure for these very dangerous diversions are being constructed, the chief perpetrators of climate crimes continue to get away with murder, literally. Now, these are the fossil fuel, agrochemical, agribusiness, extractive industry, the mega infrastructure corporations who have made no changes to their operations. But they have the money, lots of money, to invest in carbon markets and to finance these so-called nature positive offset projects. And also they build responsible public images for themselves by hiring spin doctors and by financing these multi-stakeholder initiatives with large environmental NGOs, with environmental foundations, think tanks, digital companies, consultants, and so on. They use the language of gender equality, youth, feeding the world, securing workers' rights, increasing farmers' incomes, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals. But all of these contribute to inflating this big boondoggle, this crime, this lie, which is nature-based solution. The good news, of course, is that social movements and unions and grassroots communities, indigenous and non-indigenous local communities who are actually cooling the planet, who are regenerating nature and biodiversity, who are, restoring seeds and, native seeds and rebuilding actually locally, territorially embedded food systems through agroecology and food sovereignty. These communities and these peoples are not food. The struggles are continuing, and the movement for agroecology and food sovereignty is growing and expanding with those who are not producers, like my organization, myself, and I'm assuming many who are listening to this webinar. And these movements are growing. And in addition to fighting the big corporations not doing what they should be doing, we need to also be supporting agroecology, food sovereignty, and showing that this is where the real solutions are. So why don't I stop here, Kirtana? Thanks.
Thank you very much, as usual. Yeah, really good linking up of also the food crisis issues. And, a lot of the solutions, the structural solutions to the food crisis that we're facing are very closely linked with also the structural solutions to climate injustice, about which type of agriculture we support, of redistribution of land, of actually providing research support to agroecology rather than agribusiness, to allow free movement of seeds. There are so many of the solutions that would work for both cases, but rather they keep bringing us these false solutions. I'm going to move swiftly on to the next speaker. I just want to say that we have already some really fantastic list of questions. So I really want to get to those questions. So don't stop. Please keep adding your questions, because as soon as we move into the Q&A section, we'll start to take some of those and I will address them to the speakers. So we will take them, but if you can, add them now. So we already have as much as we can when we go into the session, so we can allocate it immediately. So I'll move on now to our last speaker, who is Devlin Kuyek from Grain. And he is one of Grain's most active researchers. He joined Grain in 2003 after working with several organizations and peasant organizations in Malaysia and the Philippines. He works mainly on monitoring and analyzing global agribusiness, including land grabs. And he's based in Montreal in Canada. And Devlin has been doing a lot of research, as those of you who read Grain's updates will know, about some of the existing soil carbon and carbon market schemes that businesses are doing. So Devlin will give us a bit of an insight as to how that is actually working in practice. And several of these exist, as Shalmali was saying as well, in Asia, in Australia. Now the European Union is developing it. The US has been doing it for many years. And I think Devlin will give us an example from there as well. So Devlin, please.
Thank you, Kirtana. And it's lovely to be with everybody here. Yeah, so just to start maybe by saying quickly, if you're experiencing carbon farming in the global south, you're probably you're seeing it as large-scale tree plantations, because that's the form that it's mainly taking right now. One example would be the company African Agriculture Inc., which trades on the US NASDAQ stock exchange, and which has just signed a deal with the Niger government for a lease of 2 million hectares to plant pine trees. So, this is the kind of projects that you're seeing expanding. When you hear the term carbon farming in Europe or in other places where industrial agriculture dominates, what it essentially means is these tweaks to industrial agriculture practices that are supposedly can sequester carbon in the soil, and then you can claim a carbon credit for that. Those programs are also now moving into the global south. So as Shalmali was describing in places like India. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to focus on one example that I think helps to clarify the corporate agenda with carbon farming, and how corporations are advancing it. About a decade ago, you may remember that Monsanto made a controversial takeover of a digital agricultural company, one of the first of its kind, called the Climate Corporation. And through that acquisition, over the years, it's developed one of the first major digital agriculture platforms, which is now called Climate FieldView. And FieldView is really just an app, and it collects data from satellites and from sensors in farm fields and sensors on tractors, and then uses algorithms to advise farmers on their farming practices. So Monsanto, which is now Bayer, will tell farmers when and what to plant, how much pesticides to spray, and give them suggestions on how much fertilizer to apply and where, etc. And the Bayer Monsanto now says that FieldView is already being used on farms covering over 24 million hectares in the US, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and Europe. Fast forward to 2020, and Bayer launches its carbon program. So it's a carbon farming program. It's called the Carbon Program in the US. It's called the Carbon Initiative in Europe, and it's called Carbon Plus in Brazil. Now, to be part of this carbon farming program, farmers have to be enrolled in Bayer's FieldView digital program. And so Bayer will use the FieldView app to instruct farmers on the implementation of essentially two practices that are claimed to sequester carbon in the soil: reduced tillage or no tillage, and the second one, planting of cover crops. And then through the FieldView app, it will monitor farmers on their implementation of these two practices and estimate the amount of carbon that the participating farmers have sequestered. And farmers are then supposed to be paid according to Bayer's calculations for how much carbon they've sequestered. And Bayer will then use that information to claim carbon credits and sell these into carbon markets. Now, this past August, in August 2022, Bayer launched a new program in the US called Foreground, F-O-R ground. The main difference with the carbon program is that companies, corporations, can also enroll in Foreground, not just farmers. So upstream companies can use a platform to advertise and offer discounts for tilling machines, for forage seed, and for the sale of other inputs. But Bayer's big target with this is the downstream food companies, especially the downstream big food companies who can use the platform to claim Scope 3 emissions reductions in their supply chains. So in September, the giant poultry company, Purdue Farms, announced a collaboration with Bayer for its Foreground program. And under this collaboration, farmers who supply feed grains, soybeans and corn, to Purdue will be enrolled in Foreground so that Purdue can then track their carbon footprints and then sell its chicken under the claim that its chicken is carbon neutral, right? Even though Purdue continues to expand its production and sales of chicken, which is a highly polluting product. It's not clear if farmers are going to get any benefits from this. In the joint press release, if you read it carefully, it says that it only says that farmers may be compensated for tracking their carbon footprint. And then you have to understand that if farmers who don't enroll in this program, they may eventually be unable to sell their corn or their soybeans to Purdue, or they may be paid less by Purdue for the grains that Purdue buys from them. Plus, it gives Purdue a lot of information about the farmers that they're buying from, which they can use to negotiate for better prices and exert greater control. But the real winner here is Bayer, because it gets increasing control over farmers. It gets to dictate exactly how they farm and what inputs they use. And it gets more and more information about farmers, so it becomes more sophisticated in how it can exert that control. No-till itself, which Bayer promotes through this carbon program, is essentially the spraying of tons and tons of Roundup, glyphosate, on Bayer's Roundup-resistant soybeans and corn. So that's essentially what they mean by no-till, and that's what they promote through their program. Bayer is also interested in making profit from the promotion of cover crops. The very month that they launched Foreground, it bought up a seed company that is producing a gene-edited cover crop called covercress. And seeds of covercress will be sold to farmers who are enrolled in Foreground. and then that crop will be sold as a biofuel. So you can see in the way that Bayer's programs have evolved that for companies like Bayer, carbon farming is a really excellent way for them to increase their control in the food system. It's certainly not about sequestering carbon. There's really no permanence, as Vitor has already mentioned. Here we're talking about a 10-year guarantee that the carbon will remain sequestered in the soil. So it has, there's no way that this could be considered as a real offset to burning of fossil fuel emissions. And it's really hardly verifiable. Most of the verification here is going to take place through satellites and off-farm monitoring. And it's not about generating a new revenue stream for farmers either, because really what we see here, as you can see in the foreground case, is that the companies are the ones who are going to profit from this, and farmers are actually going to be penalized if they are not part of enrolling in these programs. So I'm going to leave it there. I know we have little time left now for question and answer. So back to you, Kirtana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devlin. Yeah, I mean, I think there's if you look at the grain newsletters, they've also published a couple of articles which also has links to then some of the different schemes that they are investigating, which I highly encourage people to read. It's very interesting to see what's actually being done by the corporation. So thanks so much to Devlin for actually leading on this research. I think for all of us, it's very, very useful. So I'm not going to say much more. What I will say in closing is just to thank all the speakers very much. And that, this is the start, as I said, of a discussion that we are trying to have at all different levels with people specifically in the food sovereignty and agroecology movement, because we see this growing tendency for agroecology to become part of this NBS platform, for some of our movements to think that nature-based solutions is a place to get funding for small-scale agroecology, for example, and some of these things need to be thrashed out. So I think it's very good if we move now. So thank you very much to all the speakers. I just want to say that we didn't have Ruth Nyambura, who's from the Kenyan Ecofeminist Collective, who was going to provide a really useful agrarian justice perspective from Africa and how this is playing out, but she is not able to be here because her internet connection has dropped. So we'll try as much as we can to get her perspective as well and somehow send it to all of you. But for now, I would really like to invite all of you to click on the Zoom link that's being put into the Crowdcast chat, and that will bring you straight in for the Q&A session, which we can have face-to-face. And we have a few minutes for that as well. So it will, I think, be posted now in the Crowdcast chat, and we'll wait a few minutes for all of you to join. And I have the list of questions which we will address. It's been posted now in the chat. So do join that. And I'll give everybody about a minute to join us, and we will start the session then. So thanks everybody who is leaving us now. Thanks everybody who is watching this later as well. We will hopefully be able to send all the materials that we put in the chat for all of you to read as well later and have more discussions on this. And I think there are further sessions as well in the ORFC on this topic. So interesting for all of you. Or all of these as well. On this, and I think there are further. Welcome to everybody who's coming in. Can I just ask you all to make sure that you keep yourself muted, because there's a lot of people, which is fantastic. But just to make sure that we have okay. I think people are still joining. Okay, we'll just give a couple of seconds more for those who are joining. Welcome, welcome everybody. It's very nice to actually be able to see who you're talking to. Okay. Oh, we're still getting people. Okay. Every time I think we've finished. So yes, this will be recorded and shared. So the quick Q&A, I believe, is not being recorded and shared, so we can have an open discussion. But the actual presentation will be recorded and shared. Okay, I think we can start because people have kind of stopped coming. We have really a lot of people, which is fantastic. Can everybody put yourself on mute because I'm hearing some feedback. Thank you. Perfect. Okay. So we have already a list of really good questions that I'm going to direct immediately to some speakers because we only have about 15, 20 minutes left. So the first, I'm going to group a couple of questions. Two of them, or three of them rather, are broadly around the same topic, which is a really big one, and maybe it's something that everybody is thinking. So it's very good, I think, to address that first. The first question is net zero always a bad thing? What about those that do look to reduce first or invest in better technologies? So that's the first question. And I'm going to group these. So a linked question is the second one we've got is surely it isn't necessarily nature-based solutions or net zero that are the problem, but rather the way that they've been hijacked for greenwashing by those with other agendas in the same way most high traction movements are. NBS and net zero as concepts themselves seem to make a lot of sense, but in practice have had negative effects. Should they be then thrown out, or would it be better to ensure better implementation and protection from those with negative intent? And the third question, which I'm putting in this because we have several questions, is, oh, sorry, I lost it. How do we stop corporations parasitizing and exploiting the good intentions of people genuinely interested in biodiversity conservation and environmental justice? They seem to be able to capture everything for their benefit and rely on misinformed but good people. So there's a whole package of issues there around, whether the concept itself are bad, whether we can have safeguards to actually do good NBS, which is a big discussion as well. So I'm going to take a couple of those, and then if it's okay, I would like to direct also Vitor, if you can answer. And I'm literally going to give all the panelists a minute to answer, although these are massive questions, so that we can actually take the next round of questions. So if I can start with giving this a go. So I think the first thing to say is that the idea, so the justification for the net part of net zero, which is the kind of absorption part instead of emissions reductions, was to be, in fact, for so-called residual emissions. So places where you could not reduce emissions. But that is absolutely not the case anymore at all. So what we have now is we have about 1,500 corporations across the board, fossil fuels, agribusinesses, all of them, who have announced net zero targets, but the net zero targets include expanding production. So Shell has an expansion plan. ENI has an expansion plan. Nestle has an expansion plan.
Find it. How bad's that?
Sorry, can you put yourselves on mute, please? Thank you. Yeah, they all have massive expansion plans to expand their business model, and then are hoping to draw back down emissions via the so-called net zero. It's not just corporations, governments are doing that as well. So the UK government has, kind of dialed up its net zero strategy, where it's going to emit till 2050 and then hope that we have some technologies available to draw carbon back down into the atmosphere. So net zero in the way that it's being done now is bad. So what we need is real zero. And there are ways to reach real zero. And that has to be what we need to do, which is to stop fossil fuel emissions, to stop emissions. And then we see what we do. Of course, we want to treat, we want to protect biodiversity. We want better types of farming. So in the same way, I think for the answer for the second question is that the idea of nature-based solutions is that it can actually compensate for emissions, and that is absolutely not the case. Unless we stop emissions, there is nothing we can do. It will never compensate for us actually changing, transforming. There is no getting away. We can't continue business as usual and then hope that nature-based solutions will solve the problem for us. And that's the way it's being used now. So in my view, that I think we've lost. You know, there was never our nature-based solutions never came from us. It's not like agroecology or food sovereignty. Nature-based solutions is kind of this blanket program that is now getting so much funding thrown at it that a lot of people who are doing things that we, you know, we've all of us in our movements have been doing for years, whether it's peatland restoration, small-scale agriculture, agroecology, now feel the need to package it under this terminology of nature-based solutions because the government wants us to do that, or because we're getting financing to do that. And of course, there are some good things, but the package by itself, what's being given to us under the nature-based solutions package, is hugely problematic. So agroecology and food sovereignty is not the same as nature-based solutions, and we should make a huge attempt in our movements to separate the two terms. Is my take on it. And I don't know, Vitor, if you want to say, have a minute as well to respond to this.
Yes, in the matter of fact, I think that those questions are very interlinked, and they all rely on three questions that are the property rights, the public policies, and the scale effects. So what I mean is that the question is not more than adopting new technologies to reduce emissions, is to acknowledge the role of certain techniques that are already implemented and that are threatened by this agribusiness model throughout the world and throughout Europe, acknowledging them and support them properly with public policies. That is, in our view, the most effective policy to not only to guarantee a path for real zero emissions, in this case in farming, but also to provide sustainability in other important variables that are the socioeconomic and the territorial ones that have a lot to do with the, for example, the severe damages that we experience here in Portugal, for example, through the wildfires and so. Therefore, the question is, when we talk about the net zero solutions, the question is against which base scenario. If the initial scenario is a already degraded scenario, then there is no real improvement compared to the situation some decades ago, and that should be the base for for a proper balance for real zero solution. So we think that the question is that from the beginning, the corporations, the agribusiness, should not be allowed to go for a certain level of pollution or degradation of soil and of landscape, and at the same time, and therefore should not be compensated for just mitigating that damages, and at the same time the contribution that is being smashed up by these public policies currently in action in the European Union. The contribution of small-scale farming throughout the territories should be addressed properly with proper public support. Of course, there is a lot of space to induce the transformative technologies and the adoption of better practices that envisage this, improvements in all these environmental and socioeconomic variables that we think that should be considered together.
Thank you, Vitor. Okay, so I have a next set of questions. There's so many good questions. I'm really sorry. I'm not going to be taking all of them, but they definitely give us material, I think, to do future discussions and sessions. So Shalmali, I'm going to come to you with two questions, maybe three, but I still need you to do it in a couple of minutes. Sorry about that. So one is specifically directed to you of, can you provide specific examples of how carbon credits paid to smallholders result in dispossession and concentration of resources to corporations? The second is, do the speakers think all small farmers are angels when it comes to climate impact? Surely a big project that supports agroecology is not in itself bad. And similarly, many small farms that are degenerative are definitely bad. There's a third question that I will put to you and Jutta maybe, which is a very, also very insightful, is how far do the panelists feel that support for carbon farming, nature-based solutions, and rewilding risks undermining efforts to achieve better collaboration between the nature conservation, environmental sector, and the agroecological farming movement? So I will let Shalmali do the first two. The last question, I think, is a very particular problem, I think, for Europe and the US and Western. It's very different in the Global South, how it works in the Global South. But so maybe Shalmali can have a go, and we'll try to answer that, those of us who are more based in Europe. Shalmali, please.
Yeah. Kirtana, I couldn't understand the second question. Could you say that again? Because it's not written. Just say
I'll
that
also
again.
Post it in the chat.
Yeah, just write it in the chat, please. Yeah. Thanks. So about the question about the specific example, here's what's happening now with carbon farming. It hasn't taken off fully yet. What we have are experiences from RED and payment of ecosystem services in the past, and what's happened with the blue economy. And in those situations, what happened was even the calculation of carbon credits was so complex, because you have to then find, it has to be identified, the carbon credit has to be identified, it has to be measured, it has to be validated. And there are lots of criteria for that, which include, language of additionality and so on and so forth. Now, smallholders themselves or forest communities, in the case of RED, were not able to do this themselves. What they had was a community forest. They were looking after their forests and their land. And then come along these large environmental NGOs and these consulting companies with these formula and so on and so forth, saying that they're going to try to measure how much forest carbon there is in their community forests. I'm giving you the example of RED. And in the case of Cambodia, for example, it completely collapsed the community forestry that communities had built up for years, because they hadn't actually been fighting with each other or keeping track of whose was a bigger tree and whose was a smaller tree. This was a community forest. So what happened was, again, the question that I raised in my presentation: who owns, quote unquote, owns, who has rights to carbon? You're taking something very material like land and forest and trees, and then you are extracting from that so-called non-material benefits. So how does that work? And for many of the now in the case of carbon farming, if you have 2 hectares of land or 1 hectare of land on which you've been doing agroecological farming, or maybe 5 families work a plot together around a forest, how are they going to try to figure out what additional activity they need to do to be able to get a carbon credit from that? And more often than not, for smallholders and for forest communities who don't have legal tenurial rights that are recognized on a piece of paper, these lands that they are farming and they're living off will be called degraded or deforested lands. They will be claimed, and they are being claimed for reforestation and afforestation schemes. And so that's how they lose. There's a great risk of them losing their land, and many have been evicted. Now, in the case of corporate concentration, what's happening is that corporations are joining hands with carbon farming platforms, and they are expanding their presence through financing, and through providing what they call new technologies, new till, new seeds, and so on and so forth. So many of the agribusiness companies that are investing in these carbon farming platforms actually also have other economic interests by which they can secure carbon credits and make it.
Charles, sorry, I'm going to have to
I'm stopping.
stop you there. Yeah, no, that's okay. Devlin is also answered in the chat. Yeah, so we only have a minute left. But I think we've collected all the questions because we are very tight on time because all the sessions are running very much sequentially. But we have collected all the questions, and I think they are certainly very interesting to give us more. We hope to have more discussion. I think this is not the only one. Many of our organizations are working at many different levels to have the discussions. And so, yeah, I think some of them will be very useful for that. So I just want to thank you all very much. I want to close this session. And while I'm closing, I'm just going to show you a slide, which I think Jutta will share as well another time. And while I do that, I just want to say that, we have, as I said before, we have the solutions which are grounded in people's decentralized visions of what are available to us and what are available to communities who are actually working on the ground, who have been implementing the solutions for years and years. And that's what we need to see. And if we start to compare what is happening, as some of us are trying to do, and what are the principles that we follow when we actually talking about agroecology, would include social justice, environmental justice, gender justice, and different types of justice, historical justice, with what are the solutions that are being promoted now, gives us a very clear framework to see what we want and what we don't want. So we don't have to go just by the terminology, because of course some projects are good, some are not, but it's very important to see what's behind them. If you have financing for them, what is the financing doing? Where is it coming from? What are the impacts of your project if they extend to the global south and on other countries and other regions? So I think that's just some of the ways in which we will try to have the discussion. But thank you so much, all of you. It's been really great. And yeah, thanks all for your questions and contributions. And we will continue to organize and promote our solutions. And we'll find a way to send you all the materials that we have as well, have collected, that the speakers have talked about. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.